Hey everyone, this is my 10-minute video in support of the scholar strike. My name is Rambaran-Olm and I'm a medievalist specializing in the early English period. I'm currently a research fellow at the University of Toronto and one of the only BIPOC scholars in the field of early English studies. To give you all some background on my field, you won't be surprised to know that it attracts predominantly white people because it has been framed and curated to center on white Eurocentrism. We know that the Middle Ages and history in general did not just happen in Europe, but we center whiteness of Europe in my field. My field of an area of specialization is it's also known as Anglo-Saxon studies, and as you might expect, it has a huge problem with white supremacy. It has little to no idea how to deal with that and the history around that, though. So why is the field so white? Historically, early English studies was perceived, taught, and studied within an empirical framework, which most often centered on an implicit bias surrounding British origins. We know too that the American forefathers like Jefferson were obsessed with linking to a mythological Anglo-Saxon past and launching an Anglo-Saxon project. This idea of being a WASP isn't scrutinized as it should be. What is an Anglo-Saxon? There are only 3 references to Anglo-Saxons in Old English writings. I and others have written about how the term was out of use for hundreds of years and only came back into use and fashion when England began its colonizing expedition. As students and scholars, we need to interrogate the history of the term and the term itself. I have a resource page up on Medium for students and scholars to use, and it's a breakdown of the term and has links to a collection of other useful readings to bring you up to speed on the discussion. Eric Wade and I have compiled a bibliography focused on important readings of race and critical race studies that relate to early England. Our biblio is in chronological order to show just how much of our work has benefited from and relies on the work of Black scholars that we don't often acknowledge. Another biblio to use is Dr. Jonathan Hsu, that's HSY, and Dr. Julie Orlemansky's bibliography that's much more extensive and includes works from most subfields within medieval studies as a whole. And you can find all those on Medium. What we as a field have forgotten or dismissed is the number of Black scholars, particularly Black women, who have written about these topics for decades. We're pretending that they don't exist. This, for me, as a Black scholar of mixed heritage, is important. Not only because I'm one of the few Black scholars in the entire field, but one of the only Black women in all of early English studies. Why is this so? Because our field is not addressing race and racism. We cannot have Black Lives Matter hashtags in our bios or blackout profiles without considering the Black lives in academia. Medievalists continue to perform a type of false allyship that shows that they care about BLM in the abstract and not actual Black lives. These moments where we're seeing footage of Black men and women executed in front of our eyes is horrifying. The problem is that we're not staying engaged, so we need to stay engaged. Over the past few years and with alarming frequency, medieval images have been turned into memes and posted without context on white supremacist websites and around social media. You all remember Charlottesville and the March of Incels that served as a catalyst in our field for discussing race and racism. We were confronted with blatant images, particularly runic and Viking Age symbols that had been misappropriated by white supremacists, but something else that put the spotlight on our field was a notorious image of a screaming white supremacist. This image was traced back to a man of 20 years old who was once a student of medieval studies. We need to look at ourselves more seriously and consider why people who have these leanings towards white supremacy and neo-Nazism are attracted to our field. Other posts on various social media platforms remind us medievalists that white people outside the field in particular are making dangerous and inaccurate links between symbols, images, historical events, and white supremacy. It is our job to push back and correct those narratives. I think students can do a better job of this. They're more equipped in some ways because they don't put up with bullshit. And they also have a better understanding sometimes of the issues today, where scholars who cloister themselves away like monks pretend that everything is okay. Franz Fanon once reminded a struggling philosophy student that philosophy never saved anyone. Well, medieval studies has never saved anyone either. But when we make more corrections to a whitewash narrative, start decentering Europe and talking about how historical frameworks have served capitalism and white supremacy, we will be saving lives in ways we may not consider. And this is something you can talk about in your classrooms. Back to the posts. While posts, memes, and the pernicious ideas behind them proliferate, medievalists of early England and our organizational leadership have largely remained silent over the years until more recently. One major reason for the silence and slow movement is that the field is too white, on top of apathy and complacency. There's a sense of elitism that somehow scholars are above interacting with the general public. But you know what else is not addressed? Fear. I think a lot of scholars are scared, and this fear is partially based on confrontation, and so they minimize outsiders as non-educated. And the fact is, a lot of white supremacists are well informed and they're incredibly smart. They have masters and PhDs, sometimes in history, and they distort narratives and are often exclusionary. This is why I and other BIPOC and other marginalized scholars have been encouraging you all to speak up and not just hide, ignore, dismiss, or block people. There's an audience outside of the white supremacists and racists you're correcting. You're not there to change racist minds, but people on the outskirts are watching. And I should say too that when you speak up, you're speaking up for the marginalized. You're centering BIPOC people. You're telling racists that Black lives, Indigenous lives, Brown lives, and other POC lives matter. And that's why you speak up. Another point is that white people cannot keep themselves in check on race and racism in our field. For any one part of the intellectual community, and that is you too, students, white people cannot have successful and fruitful race discussions without having BIPOC scholars to interact with and without engaging with our work. White people in the field, my field, want to dominate conversations on race when they want to be white saviors, they want to be the Robin DiAngelos, and they perpetually erase us. We have too many works of scholars of color, particularly Black scholars, to pretend that you are inventing or reinventing anything. You're late to the game. So instead of giving this false whitewash narrative where you're thought leaders in the field, look at the works of scholars of color and those giants who came before you and whose shoulders you stand on. Du Bois, Cooper, Crenshaw, Houston, Lala, Fannin, Morrison, Davis, C.L.R. James, Stuart Hall, Mbembe, Robinson, Margot Hendricks, the other Hall, Kim, Ian Smith, DeWeaver, and others, and other marginalized scholars, and build on their work. This erasure of scholars of color that have come before you and pretending that you've discovered things is Columbusing. White people cannot lead in these discussions. They benefit from most exclusively. White people should be listening to BIPOC scholars in the field. White people, white students, non-Black PC need to let us lead in these discussions. We are not just commodities. This means addressing the roots of capitalism and understanding how that plays into how we learn. We need to reflect on Cedric Robinson's racial capitalism and make those connections with who gets to learn, what value it has, and how Black and other scholars of color are racialized and used within the academy. Ask yourselves, when do our lives as Black scholars and other non-Black POC lives matter? What can you do? Listen to us. Follow our lead, pay BIPOC scholars to speak, read our work, cite us. When you screw up, be humble and we'll work together. The more you worry about you and your feelings, the less you will accomplish, and then we will see you with more suspicion. The burden of identifying this problem and trying to fix the whiteness of the field, the lack of understanding of racism, anti-racism, and so forth, has fallen on us BIPOC scholars within various subfields. Our labor is taken for granted and we're exhausted. So the pushback is incredible. And when I say incredible, it's just complete bullshit. We take the brunt of attacks both from within and outside the field, and those of us with dark skin do carry the greatest burden. Colorism is an issue and that my field will not address, and we should be addressing, since that white lady was exposed for masquerading as a Black scholar for decades in her field. Until we start grappling with these issues and start dismantling institutional bullshit, we're not going to change anything. Until then, do not recommend students of color to join, and students of color, don't kid yourselves, you are not going to fix anything. We have to dismantle and burn to the ground the field in order for something better to emerge. White people need to quit trying to save this field and make it relevant until you are old enough to retire. My challenge for you as students and scholars is to sit down and think about what Black Lives Matter means. My field, our field, was founded on white supremacist narratives that has whitewashed history in a way to exclude those of us that have made England and America empires. And yes, America is an empire, Wouldn't be if it didn't have 800 bases in over 70 countries worldwide. We need to start figuring out ways to dismantle white supremacist frameworks within the academy. You can't bring more BIPOC students and scholars into a broken system. Nothing will change. Dismantling the system means changing the way our field is structured, and that means essentially burning it down. Something that people are not prepared to do because they spent time and money learning Old English, Old Norse, Old Irish, whatever. Those languages have saved absolutely zero people in our present day. I don't have the answers. That's for us scholars and students of history to figure out together. But these are the questions you need to ask in the classroom. How does systemic racism work? What does it look like? Who gains most within the existing framework? What are some of the facets of white supremacy? What should we change? Why should we change this system? Why is medieval studies so white? What does Anglo-Saxon mean? And why does it mean white? What are you doing to make your colleagues and students of color, particularly your Black scholars and students, know that their lives matter? If we want to change and disrupt medieval studies in academia, we have to know what white supremacy means and how it manifests before knowing how to dismantle it. Thank you.